Now, before we come to our first panel discussion, I would like to ask you a question again. So, if you like to go to your Menti, if you have to log in again, here are the login options, the QR code, or also the password 25313943. And the question I'm asking you, and that we will also discuss on the panel that's ensuing, is, in your opinion, where is action most needed to address climate-related migration and displacement? So you can choose one option. Is it national policy where action is most needed? Is this our international agreements or framework, on-the-ground projects and programs, research and data, finance? You can choose one of these answers. I think most of you have made a choice, so let's see the results. Okay. A lot of you think that national policy has to be, is the place where action is most needed. International agreements, frameworks, on-the-ground projects and programs. Finance doesn't seem to be big of an issue. I don't know if that's correct. Research and data, that will be interesting also to talk about on the panel. Okay, so I would like to ask, because if we want to go on stage, we have to move the screens, so maybe someone can lift the screens for us. That's cool, huh? Magic. So, yeah, I mean, we have heard all morning what the facts and numbers are in terms of climate change and migration. We have seen just now some examples of what that means in different regions of the world. And we would now like to go deeper on what should be done in an in-depth discussion I will be having with my guests. And I would like to introduce them to you. Welcome Marine de Clarens. Marine is Policy Officer and Program Manager at the Unit Migration and Forced Displacement at European Commission DG for International Partnership. Welcome Marine, and I hope you give her a warm applause. Maybe you just can take the second seat on the left. Thank you. Michelle Yonetani, she is Senior Policy Officer at the Office of the Special Advisor for Climate Action at the UN Refugee Agency. Welcome, Michelle. Would you like? Yeah. Vally Koubi, she is Professor at the Center for Comparative and International Studies at ETH Zurich and Professor at the Institute of Economics at the University of Berne. Welcome, Vally.
Thank you.
Please. And welcome back, Professor Walter Kälin, whom we had the pleasure to listen to earlier on. He's, among a lot of other things, the envoy of the chair of PDD, the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Welcome back, Walter Kälin. You can take a seat. Okay. Please help yourself with water if you need. Remember also, you can participate by asking questions in the Menti. You have one section where you can ask questions, and if you see a question that you think is really important and you would like to have answered at the panel, you can give it a like, I think, or a thumbs up. I'm not sure, a thumbs up. So this question will be further up in the priorities of questions. So you can ask questions, but you can also say, oh, wow, that's a good question. I would really like to have an answer on that. Walter Kälin, I would like to start with you. You know, the Platform for Disaster Displacement has like 6 areas, action areas I saw on your on the platform's website that is important. So can you just give us a quick overview what these 6 areas of action are on the platform?
Thank you. What you saw on the website is basically kind of an overview on our work plan and our working methods. But I already explained in my presentation that what we promote is what we call this toolbox approach.
Yes.
Let's use all the tools that are available, otherwise we will not be able to tackle the challenge. And to achieve that, reduce emissions, help people to stay, help people to move, protect those who are displaced. What do we need? First, we need that the international community, states, international organizations really work across policy silos. And that's part of what we do, to promote policy coherence through messaging at international conferences, at regional levels, through also research where we have identified gaps. Second, what we need is, there are so many already existing good practices. And countries, actors need to learn from each other. And that's where we focus on identifying best practices and again, promote them. And finally, what we need is to really help the different regions to advance. And we just have heard from Manare in the Pacific, the discussion is very different as compared, for instance, in the Horn of Africa. So we are investing quite a lot of supporting regional, sub-regional organizations. Now, we're just at the secretariat level, 7 people. And we can't do all of that without bringing people together. And I think that's our real strength, to provide that platform, to bring people together from different backgrounds, and again, establish partnerships across the silos. And that's the 6 areas.
You mentioned silos, so that, if I understand you well, there are still too much silos.
Well, let's look at which policy areas are important. First, there is the whole debate on the implementation of the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, that's the climate negotiations. There you don't have the migration specialists. Migration, that's the Global Compact on Migration, that's the UN network on migration. Then, in order to help people to stay, it's UNDRR, the UN organization dealing with disaster risk reduction, the Sendai framework. And if you go to these conferences, some of us are always there. But if you're looking at the government representations, it's different ministries. It's different also academic institutions that work either on climate change or DRR, and that's where we have to establish policy coherence. No contradictions. Let's build on each, the strengths of each of the actors and bring them together. And that's why we are a platform trying to bring together all these actors.
Michelle, Yonetani, how would you have answered the Menti question? Have you answered it?
No, I didn't actually.
How would you have answered it? What is the most important point, you have to focus on now?
I'm glad I didn't have to answer it, because they're all necessary. Absolutely. We need the really strategic level change to happen. The scale, the nature of the challenge, the need for collaboration, as Walter's just saying, is so huge. The need for the role that governance plays in all of this, of course, absolutely critical. So often when we start talking about climate change, everyone's thinking just about the weather. But when we're talking about the impacts of climate change on people, on ecosystems, on society at large, we need all of these things from the strategic level, but right down to the ground, so that implementation part is huge. Well, what we're hearing indeed is that those countries and those communities that are facing already the harshest impacts of climate change, that because of pre-existing vulnerability, inequity, inequality, poverty, conflict, violence, all of these things create the context in which that extreme weather, those slow onset processes of change, are going to be doing more and more damage in the future. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about displacement, the forced movement of people. So how do you choose is the question. It depends on where you're going, who you're speaking to at any time. But at the end of the day, it's the delivery on the ground that matters. It's how the communities themselves and the countries themselves are actually benefiting from all of this discourse that's happening, from these frameworks that are out there. We know that there are always far more frameworks and laws and policies out there than there are perhaps in real change on the ground, the actual implementation. And the financing piece is absolutely huge, and that's why you're seeing such an enormous amount of discussion around it, why so many people are messaging on it as their number one message going into the COP this year, for example.
So on the ground, you were talking about financing and finances. Marine, you're on the side of the donors on this panel. What would you say? What is the most important area that has to be
Well, I was actually surprised to see on the Menti that financing is at the least priority, so I'm thinking maybe I should go. Well, again, this is a very complex issue. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. I really actually like what you just mentioned, and I think it resonates here in this room, given that there's so many representatives from civil society. So, and what we just saw as well on should I stay or should I go? I think we're building all these frameworks, all these strategies, but let's not forget the essential on the ground. We should never forget to ask people what do they actually want to do. I think sometimes we go too fast. No? So I think this is actually really important not to forget the reality on the ground. What do people want? So I just wanted to say this before going into the donor's perspective on what we see at DG INTPA. So DG INTPA is the Director General at the European Commission for International Partnerships. So it used to be DG DEFCO, for those who were familiar with DG DEFCO, which is so international cooperation. For us, the main priority is to make our policy fit our programs. So we have developed this policy highlighting very, very strongly the need for this nexus that's been mentioned previously as well, humanitarian development and peace nexus. And I think this is kind of a revolution, maybe also within the EU. Maybe from the outside you don't see it, but there's really necessity to work together. So we've built this policy together with DG ECHO, so humanitarian aid, but we work also very closely with the EAS, the Foreign Affairs. So really having this wholesome view of what we are trying to achieve, the way we're working together and avoid silos. So this, I think, is really our main priority, to work on the nexus and make this policy actually trickle down to our programs. In terms of programs at DG INTPA, I mean, we have a lot of programs. I mean, as you probably know, DG INTPA, the EU is one of the biggest donor actually in humanitarian aid and in development. So we have bilateral programs within each country. We have regional programs, and we have thematic funding. So climate-induced displacement is actually at the intersection between two of our main priorities, which is climate and migration and forced displacement. So we have within our programming at DG INTPA these spending targets, so 30% for climate and 10% for...
10%?
Yes, 10% for the governance on migration and forced displacement. So these are actually in all our programmings. At DG INTPA we have these targets. So that's why climate-induced displacement is really at the intersection. So I don't know if you want me to go into more detail, but I think...
we can go into more details. But I just wanted to make sure, Walter Kälin, Marine de Clarens just mentioned this silent revolution, like this nexus that you want to make sure. Do you agree? Is the European Union really going in this direction? I mean, you have the overview, and you also...
Wow.
That's
a naughty question.
You use the term going in that direction, yes. Have we achieved what we all want to achieve in terms of nexus on the ground? No. Because if you then look not at the donor level, but at the organizations working on the ground, they all have their own mandates, they have their own organizational culture, and there to bring them together, even to understand each other, to have a common language, that's still a huge challenge. And I think even at the level of the EU, even though cooperation between the humanitarian arm and the development arm ECO and INTPA has made a lot of progress. Internally, you are also facing those challenges. And probably even within an organization like Caritas that does, on the one hand, humanitarian work, but also development work, I would imagine, even though I don't know for sure, that there must be these kind of discussions.
Yeah.
So we are on track, but it still needs a lot of efforts to really implement this nexus in a solid way. Also because there's a problem. It doesn't work if it's just at the level of the donors and the organizations. Ultimately, we are talking about the primary responsibility of governments for their own populations, their own people. And this requires that at the level of the administrations, they are starting to work across the silos, meaning the different ministries.
Vally, Koubi, you have a special position on this panel because you are science and academia, and you are giving the data that we need to do the work then and to know what is going on. So how would you, I mean, one of the possible answers was more research, better research, more data. Would that have been your answer, or do you think?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. And the reason that I'm saying that is that migration and displacement are outcomes of, as Dr. Kälin mentioned, of multiple drivers, right? Economic, demographic, political, environmental. So we as academics, we try to isolate the effect of the environment on migration. And this is not easy. I mean, there are a lot of studies where they look at one specific case, think of Syria, drought, migration. But then you cannot generalize from these instances. Then you have other research which looks at the aggregate level, looking, dipping into censuses, and then they say how many people left from one region, province, which experienced climatic events, a drought, and moved to somewhere else. Oh, you have something that we call ecological fallacy. Again, a lot of people move because of social reasons, economic reasons. So again, you cannot differentiate, you cannot tease this environment out. And then you have the predictions. You mentioned the groundswell report, where, again, individuals are not taken into consideration what they want, okay? Also, they don't look at adaptation. So it's quite, deterministic, this kind of process. So at the end of the day, policymakers do not have much information on which to act.
So you don't do your work well.
So no, it was the old times. Now we have started changing, right? Actually, I'm guilty to that because for 10 years I used to go to one place, say Uganda or Peru or Vietnam, mention it. Once interview people who had experienced some kind of a climatic event, drought or a flood, and then interview also migrants, but only once. And at that time, I have found that about 5% of my respondents will move. And I was like, environment, not much effect on migration. For the last 3 years, with my former PhD student, Dr. Jan Freihardt, who is sitting back at the end of this room, we've been in Bangladesh. And we are re-interviewing over 2,000 household heads over 3 years period. So we started—
3 years.
3 years.
Okay.
So we are in the 13th round right now, right? So we started about 3 years ago, before the monsoon, to have a baseline information about individuals, their characteristics, and the like. And then the monsoon comes, we follow those people, we interview them, then we go back there 6 months later, the next monsoon comes, we go back, in the meantime we have all these phone interviews, we are going back for the last time in January, February. And in the first, during the first period, the first interviews after the monsoon, again, we had 5-6% people who moved because of the environmental events, and because we use a very good research design, something that in jargon, political science economics, it's something like a quasi-experimental design, because we collect data or identified respondents in a very random way in 36 villages along the 250 kilometers of the Jamuna River. And these people experience a lot of riverbank erosion and drought. So we do have both types of, climatic environmental events, the sudden and the gradual ones. So to go back, after the first monsoon, it was about 5-6% of people who migrated from our respondents. The second monsoon, we went up to 10 or 11%, and now we're scared how much more people are going to leave. And these are permanent migration. And then, of course, we have another 10%, which is temporary. The numbers sounds, large. But we need also to keep in mind that Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable areas, countries in the world. But definitely, people want to stay, they don't want to leave, so they would like their governments, international organizations, donors to help them adapt. But also, we do have evidence that a lot of people who would like to go, they're unable to go. So we do find some evidence of trapped populations.
So if I understand you well, sorry to interrupt you. What you are saying is that we need more of long-term research in situ, not go there, ask questions seriously, and then come back. But
Exactly.
Okay.
This is the most important thing the international organization needs to do. This is a costly, procedure to collect this kind of data, and you need
money.
a lot of time. We need money. Okay, we don't give it to the academics. You can, have international organizations like the International of the Organization of Migration, which they collect data. But, the way they collect it can be substantially improved, as everybody else, including mine.
I would like to cut on another theme. I'm not an expert. You are all the experts on these themes. But when I talk to people, I hear a lot the term climate refugee. A lot of people say, yeah, we will have a lot of climate refugees. And if I understand it well, that term is very controversial. Michelle, why is that?
I thought that term might come up at some point. From the point of research, the starting question we ask is critical, right? Getting the question right. And I sometimes think that maybe there has been a bit too much focus on the question that's about the driver, that climate change is driving population movements of different sorts and in different contexts, right? But actually, if you look at trends, look at migration and displacement trends, including of refugees, people who've been displaced by conflict and persecution, you'll see that it's actually extremely complex indeed, and that, let's take, in terms of refugees and internally displaced persons in relation to conflict, the vast majority of those people have been living in displacement for years. These are protracted situations. So it's not just about the new flows of people, the new movements, these pictures of people crossing borders, wading through rivers and so on. Actually, no. The reality is that the majority of these people have been living in situations of vulnerability, very often deteriorating over time, because of despite the efforts of international organizations, of governments themselves, I should start with, international organizations, local organizations, and the people themselves. The challenges they're facing are just overwhelming, and guess what? Climate is adding to what they're already dealing with. This is the IPCC language around risk multiplier, right? So that's the reality. I think we need to remember that. So when you hear the word or the phrase climate refugee, there's also that point, I think, that's really important. Don't forget, it's not just about understanding how climate is adding to the drivers of population movements, but what's it doing to people who are living, especially those in displacement, which almost by definition usually means in a situation of vulnerability, right? So there's that part of the term that is maybe not controversial, but perhaps a little bit misleading. It forces us to focus on one aspect of the problem only.
Walter, Kälin, do you agree?
Yes, I agree. And maybe just to complement what you said, when we're talking about climate refugee, refugee is a legal notion. It's also a notion describing a reality. So I don't have a problem if people say, yes, those affected have to flee, that's why they are refugees. The problem starts when we think they should be recognized in legal terms as refugees. Why is it problematic? Michelle just mentioned the problem of attribution. Just imagine I'm a climate refugee asylum seeker. I'm coming to Switzerland. I'm interviewed. And I have to convince the decision maker from the State Secretariat on Migration that it was global warming that caused that specific flood. Even scientists have difficulties to do that. So is it helpful? Second, we heard from Anare, people right now in the Pacific say, we rather want to stay than to leave. And I remember a leader of a very small grassroots organization from Kiribati, and she said, we see these refugees in these UNHCR camps. We don't want to end up like that in a humanitarian situation. We know one day we will have to move, but we want to have choice. So I think the better approach is to use instruments that provide people with choice. And this is about migration pathways. And we have very different models for that in Central America, South America. We have been supporting states in harmonizing their approaches to what they have in their domestic laws, humanitarian visa, temporary protection status, things like that. In the Horn of Africa, I was invited by the sub-regional organization IGAD to help them develop a new protocol on free movement of persons, like we have in Europe. And of course, the driver is economic. But they wanted to include a specific article, it's Article 16, that allows people affected by drought, by flooding, to profit from the free movement agreement. And there are technical details because usually you need a passport. These people don't have a passport, so what is a substitute? We regulated all of that. That's a free movement approach. Also working in other regions. In the Pacific, again, it's very different. There it would be more about migration quotas, maybe in some cases even cross-border planned relocation, even though it's tricky because of the colonial past and bad things that happened back then. But overall, it is much more about migration pathways with rights, with then protection of the people who have to migrate, rather than creating a new refugee status that would not really work in reality.
So, there is this discussion going on if we have to adapt the refugee convention so that the people who have to move are like, they don't have to come to Switzerland and convince the Beamte in Berne that, yes, I had to move because of whatever. So if I understand well, you're not particularly fond of the idea to...
No, the problem is, even if you have a refugee status, they still have to convince. Every asylum seeker coming to Switzerland now has to convince the authority, I have a well-founded fear of persecution. Only then you are granted asylum. And if you create something like a climate refugee status, then the asylum seeker has to convince the authorities that it was because of climate change impacts. It might work in one situation, and that's, as we heard before, the northern part of the Pacific, where you really have the very low-lying atolls. But there, anyway, we'll have regional solutions. And people should not have to wait till they have to flee. They, again, should have the possibility to relocate before they end up in a humanitarian disaster. And so, again, we don't need that. But if you're looking at other regions, as I said, it's better to use again, very often, contractual agreement approach, but that is more on the migration than the refugee side, because as I said, it helps to give people choices. It builds on their agency and not on their vulnerability. Having said that, there are situations where people already now under the 51 Refugee Convention can get recognition as refugees and asylum in climate change contexts. But they are relatively rare. It's a complex legal issue. I could now speak for half an hour on that, but I think we leave that
Preferably
aside.
not. Yes. Michelle, what is the UNHCR
HCR.
sorry, saying about what is the take on the refugee convention, to include people who have to move because of climate change.
So it goes back again to what I was saying. So climate is not a separate standalone issue. It's a risk multiplier. It's a systemic risk, as Catalina was saying, right? So first of all, characterizing anything as climate. So we use a lot of shorthand. You'll see everyone's using shorthand all the time. Climate migration, climate displacement. But think for a second. Think of all the presentations we've just heard and what that actually means. And if it's helpful in terms of then thinking about what are the solutions for people, what can be done to address what the problem actually is here, right? And it depends on where you sit, what your competencies are, what your capacities are, what your mandate is for some institutions, right? As to what role you can play. So for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, absolutely, as Walter was referring to, I mean, it has a special mandated responsibility, as many of you are aware, I'm sure, a supervisory responsibility for the application of international conventions that help to provide international protection for people who are displaced, right? And who, because the state is unwilling in their home country or unable to provide that protection to them, indeed, they need this international protection. I'm sure Walter can give a much more refined version of that. I'm not a lawyer, but that's basically what we're looking at. So yes, so UNHCR provides advice and support to states. There's something called the legal considerations. You can Google that with UNHCR attached and climate attached, and you'll find advice there and guidance given on in what circumstances, those that do exist, do the existing international frameworks apply, international law apply, and also regional instruments that exist. For example, the OAU Convention related to refugees and the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America. So there are these other instruments out there. This toolbox that Walter was referring to is including these refugee law, international refugee law that's already out there. And yes, it does apply, not because it talks about climate refugees. We don't talk about war refugees either, by the way, right? We just say refugees.
Yes.
So it's where climate is coming in and playing a role in those situations where people are being affected by conflict and violence, where there's a heightened risk of them becoming persecuted. Maybe it's in a context of famine or of severe food insecurity, or maybe it's to do with environmental defenders, people who are defending their land and their forests in indigenous communities, right? And somehow this is also being linked to action being taken in the name of climate change to adapt or to mitigate the growing of biofuels, for example. I mean, there are many pathways, as you can hear, it's complex, where you can start to say climate is playing a role.
What is the take of the European Union on that question,
We don't have a take on whether there's a purpose in having a definition for climate refugees. That's really the member states, and we would support member states on this. The Commission would not have a voice. But I mean, listening to what Michelle is just saying and what Walter also mentioned, I feel also, this is my personal view, but if we talk about climate refugees, then we're also keeping away all the internal displaced and not giving them priority while they are the biggest numbers of affected by disasters. No?
Yes.
So I feel we have to be careful with the naming, and it's true that climate is the buzzword for meaningful reasons, but I would actually resonate exactly what Michelle was saying. I think it's really important to always look at context specific and to see what are we actually trying to do, and not always look at maybe climate. So that is what the EU is really focusing on through its policy, through the nexus, as I mentioned. Also, we're supporting heavily, and I'm happy that that's something that came out, which was putting heavily data collection to actually understand what are we actually talking about when we're looking at these movements of population.
Yeah, I mean, there is this number, and the number was, we heard this morning that this number may not be correct. 1.2 billion people that will have moved, that will be displaced because of climate change by 2050. So this is really, that was a frightening number. I understand, if I understood well, it's too high. What can science do, Vally, to give us better data, to give better data to policymakers, to governments, to organizations?
I think I already mentioned the research we're doing right now,
Yes.
in these 3 years, because
Yes.
we follow people. It's not only, experiencing one climatic event. It's not just the occurrence, the experience. It is to what extent this climatic event affects your well-being, and how long you can't sustain this kind of an effect, right? How many times you could go through that. So it's not a single event. It can be, the cumulative effect. It can be, as you already mentioned, the interaction of different climatic events and the like. So you need to follow people for a much longer period of time to see to what extent, when the time is going to come for them to move. Because by knowing this, then governments could act. They will have information to see what type of measures they can follow. But that will imply, again, that, you do have some kind of, participatory process. Already has been mentioned that whatever adaptation plans governments come about, they need to implement at the local level. So there must be this kind of interaction between different stakeholders, from the international organizations to NGOs, to national governments, to local communities, in order to be able to come up with processes that it will help these people to stay, right? Because, as I said, this is what they want, but there are going to be instances like Tuvalu where they have to go. In that, or in some other places like, I don't know, in Malaysia or or in Bangladesh, where the high sea level rise will make, some regions of the coastal area of Bangladesh not inhabitable. In that case, people have to move. So governments need to integrate those people into these new communities.
But do you feel like you as a scientist and the people who are doing science, and do you think that you are not listened to well enough? Or that maybe governments just take out what they could use also to make politics?
Personally, I believe that politics trumps everything. We can, first of all, research has to be robust, right? That is the most important thing in order to be able to convince the governments. But also, we needed to approach our government. I mean, there must be a discussion between policymakers and academics.
But do you think that discussion is
But
going well or not?
I don't think that it's going very well.
Why not?
We don't speak the same language, I suppose. And that it's not only between academics and the governments. Sometimes even among the academics, there is a problem of communications. We can have, as I call them, the hard scientists, the natural scientists. And they're like, mitigation, that's it. And it's like, no, you don't understand, right? There is always some kind of distributional cost there. It's political decision. And the question is, you cannot do it because of this and this and this reason. So there must be a dialogue in order, to be able to convince the governments, and also the governments to be, willing to do something. But if I have a second, I'd like to go about what type of data we need to give them, right?
Yes.
So back to the Bangladesh, because I think we can give a number. We've done, we have these 36 communities along these 250 kilometers. And all of those communities do have the same ex-ante probability of getting experience the so-called riverbank erosion and the floods. So after 3 periods, so what we can do after 3 monsoons, we can compare different villages, some villages who had experienced the riverbank erosion and some which they didn't. The ones who didn't experience erosion, probably they experienced some type of migration. People moved to get married, to go to school, and the like. And let's assume that's 2% or 2 people left, 2 households. And then the locations where experienced, the villages who experienced this kind of climatic events, they saw 70 people living. So the difference between those 70 and 2, right? It is, the climatic effect. And then you can go and say to the policymakers, here it's a number which you can trust. But among those people, there are some others who left behind. What about this? Because, we know that often only one member of the family migrates, the rest stay. Or the husband leaves and the whole family stays behind. Is this a good adaptation strategy in the face of climate change? Or it's a maladaptation? What about people who migrated? How they live their lives in the new places? So there are a lot of unanswered questions that if a policymaker asks us, we cannot really tell them much because we don't know. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of research that's need to be done.
Numbers also matter, as you just said, for policymakers, for governments. I sometimes have the feeling that I use the term climate refugee because it's also used in the media. Is used like to provoke fear also and to enable quite harsh migration policies. So, Walter Kälin, what do you think needs to be done to lessen the fear and also the borders that are being put up, for people?
Yeah. That's a very relevant and important question. Thank you. First, even though I and UNHCR kind of are very skeptical about the idea of a global convention or an additional protocol to the Refugee Convention to create a climate refugee status, I think it is important to stress these. Many people are in need of international protection. Mm-hmm. But then the question is, what are the best instruments? And here I'm coming back what I already alluded to. We have very different discourses and very different dynamics in different regions. So in some regions, it is fine to talk about a more refugee-like approach. Michel mentioned Africa, where we have the African Convention on the refugees, which is applied in situations where conflict and disasters throughout interact.
Yes.
And that's fine. And there we still see a lot of hospitality. Still governments having open borders, accepting these people when they move across borders. I mentioned just the IGAD protocol on free movement. Several African subregions have specific agreements on the movement of pastoralists, even with their animals across borders in terms of drought. So we don't need to kind of focus on the discussion we just had. As I mentioned, in the Pacific, open borders would mean, yes, we want to have some control, and the instrument is rather migration quota than a refugee status. And I think for Europe, that's also one approach that could work better, because refugees, asylum seekers panic.
Yes.
And I showed that picture, the flood of refugees arriving in Europe, even though it was really manipulated and the wrong picture. this is creating these fears. Why are we not starting to talk about, yes, let's open up migration pathways for regular, managed, safe, dignified migration. And the same for South America, North America. Because there you have spaces for policy, there you have possibilities to discuss rather like this or rather like that, and not a kind of a mechanism which then leads to crossing borders, which then leads to extremely narrow interpretations of the definition of refugee, what we see with the 51 Convention in Europe. It had been much more generously applied when I started out doing refugee law a long time ago when I did my PhD. So let's find the best discourse that builds on the regional traditions, on domestic law, and then find out what works best for which kind of a situation. There's not one solution that fits all, and it's not refugee law that is the solution that fits all in each and every situation. This, what I'm just saying, is probably not just my perspective. Because if you're looking at the discussions we had when the Global Compact on Refugees was negotiated and the Global Compact on Migration was negotiated, there was a debate. To what extent should we include this topic into the Global Compact on Refugees? And to what extent into the Global Compact on Migration? What governments agree to, that's now kind of the standard of consensus internationally, is yes, there are certain aspects, 2 paragraphs in the Global Compact on the Refugees, but it's mainly something for the Global Compact on Migration. And there we have lots of paragraphs that address the issue on how to address the drivers, on how to open up migration pathways, on how to improve the prohibition of non-refoulement, the prohibition to not send back to these people. And it was very much that kind of fear among governments. If we just narrow it to one category of refugees, too tricky. If you open up more space for policy options, for instruments that kind of suit our traditions, then we can advance much, much better.
Thank you for this answer. So I have quite some questions here for you all. Maybe the first one for you, Marine. How can and should we communicate about the climate change migration nexus in order to give the topic needed attention and develop solutions, but not give way to populistic rhetoric? You know, you were on the other side before your work now at European Union. You were on the side of, you were on C2 and you were doing the work at the front. So maybe, yeah, how can and should we communicate about the climate change migration nexus in order to give it attention and not give too much space to populistic rhetoric?
Do you mean in Europe or in general?
I think in general.
First of all, let's keep it simple, because I think sometimes we get very scientifical, very complicated, and when you're on the implementing side, I think you often work on short periods of time, and you're not in that rhetoric that maybe people in headquarters are more used to. So I would say communication should be kept simple, and we should look at what are we actually trying to achieve. What is the impact that we're trying to achieve? And I think sometimes we get lost again in the processes and in the wording and in the mandates. And no, this is... So I feel when we're talking about climate-induced displacement, or what are we actually trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve programs or operations that are actually supporting governments or local authorities to be able to help the people within their borders. We're actually trying to help people who decide to move safely and in dignity. And we're trying to help people that decide not to move to be actually safe as well. So I feel, for me, it's about keeping the language. I mean, the whole nexus, it's actually common sense. It's about bringing together all the actors. I think here we've really spoken about this. There's no one solution. It's about partnerships, not working in silos, working together. And I think that's what the Nexus is about. It's about partnerships for an impact. And I think, I don't know if I really answered your question, but I feel it's we make it very complicated sometimes. And I think if we want to talk to implementing partners on the ground, it should be really this: keep it simple and impactful. Like, what is the impact that we're trying to achieve for the people we're trying to help?
There is a question about data. Do you think the quest for additional data becomes an excuse for inaction? You know, we know climate and mobility hotspots, so what now? Who would like to answer that question? Don't you think the quest for additional data becomes an excuse for inaction?
Okay, let's.
Michelle. No. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry. I won't speak for too long and let you come in.
No, I will not.
Whenever I hear the word data, I immediately ask for what. And interestingly, I don't think the question's asked very often, or not often enough, and not precisely enough. My big plea always, having been someone who has worked with data on all those global statistics out there, from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, for example, is that researchers, those who put out not just data, but work that data and put out a number or put out a message, is that we are all responsible for understanding who are we talking to? What's the political context also in which we're communicating that information? And no, you can't control it as much as you want to, or you perhaps like to, but you can't. But what you do have a responsibility to do is to be as clear as possible. And believe me, it's every single day we get asked about whether it's 1.2 billion or a number from here or a number from there. It's a whole different bunch of fruit in the different baskets for different purposes. Nobody's actually asking, hang on a second, what does this actually mean? Even the word migration or displacement or refugee, what does it actually mean? Who are we talking about here? And remember it, as the bigger the number, the more global it is, the more fuzzy it is, right? When we want action that actually has an impact, we have to understand the ground, and we have to go back to your point earlier, ask the people. So the science, the external science, the research, hugely important. But let's not forget, those who've got the longest term memories, the intergenerational memories, the knowledge on the ground is the communities themselves, and it's about, we have to connect to that, and we owe it to them to be really clear about who we're actually talking about.
We saw that with the example of Fiji, where people said, it started and now,
Right, so just breaking that out is really, really important. Yes, we all, I spend my life trying to summarize super complex situations into a set of talking points in bullet point form. So how do we be simple without being simplistic? How do we be clear and communicate, but not lose the meaning and the purpose of what we're talking about here? Being extremely conscious, hyper-aware of who we're talking to, because how you frame that information and that data has an enormous political consequence sometimes. It can. I've seen it happen. And you're just like going, oh my God, that was my report, and look at how they're using it. Right? I've been there. It's incredibly important. And the closer, and that's in the big halls of the UN or the international conventions and so on, but the closer you get to the ground, then that's just really not acceptable, because it can have very direct impacts on people's lives, very direct. So that's kind of my plea about the bridging, the data and the research, and making it usable, and also supporting what you're actually what you'd like it to be used for.
Would you like to add something, Vally?
Yes. Data, it's not and should not be the objective, right? It is how you will get this data, how this data is going to be used. And I agree 100% with you. When you generate this kind of data, it has to come from the lowest possible level. The people who have been affected, they have to deal and they have to make this kind of decisions. So not disagreement there. Where I disagree, no, I'm not sure whether that's exactly the case, is that scientists are not politicians. They should be far away from any kind of manipulation or whatever. Now, scientists need to present, the findings of their research in the most, first of all, the type of the research they do in the most transparent way, and present their results in the most concrete and politics-free manner. Now, whether politicians choose to manipulate that is beyond the control of the scientists. But as you said, there are different organizations, individuals who collect the data. But the data that they collect is not harmonized. It's collected with some specific purpose in mind, which is not, to delve into these drivers of migration, talk to people, trying to find what is the environment, the environment's impact. So yes, there is a lot of work to be done, but the scientists should not be politicians, policymakers. They could advise, they could show in the best possible way that their data is worthwhile looking at, but nothing more than that.
I agree.
Walter Kälin, I saw you. Would you like to add something? Do you agree?
No, I just agree.
Good.
But maybe I would like to follow up on the question on how to communicate.
Yes.
And I, again, fully agree, it has to be simple. What I see is this kind of black and white discussion. It's 1.2 billion. Let's build walls. We have to panic. Whereas an approach, and I think that's important for the community here, is the key message should be, we can actually do a lot of things. Let's help people to stay, and that's what we are doing with our work. Let's help people to move out of harm's way, and that's we or what others do or what we are advocating for. And then those who still are displaced, they need protection inside their country, across borders. And to do it, we need the political will. And I think with this kind of messaging, we can get much, much further than with alarmistic figures of 5 billion or half of that or whatever.
I think we have time for one last question. There is a lot of resistance to frame migration as a form of adaptation, specifically from the CC community, climate change community. What is the issue? Where does this resistance stem from? Why not recognize maladaptation? Who would like to answer this question? Yes.
There is a specific background to that, and that's the discussion about loss and damage versus adaptation. The problem, very simplified, is the following. The UNFCCC convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has two pillars. One is mitigation, reduction of emissions. One is adaptation. Now, countries like Fiji, others in the Pacific, the Horn of Africa, for very good reasons say, when people have to flee, this is not adapting. They lose their livelihoods, they lose their homes. So this is about loss and damage. And then the industrialized countries, for a long time, up to the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, said, no, we only have adaptation. We cannot really talk about loss and damage. And this is where the criticism is coming from. When you talk about adaptation, then you're kind of not taking seriously what it means for people, their suffering, their losses. Maybe we can go beyond that and more clearly distinguish between when human mobility, the overarching term, is adaptation. Sometimes it is adaptation. Sometimes, I'll give you an example. I met a displaced pastoralist, the leader of the community my age, in the Somali region in Ethiopia. I showed a picture. And he said, my brother was much cleverer than I was. When we had the big drought in 2011-12, he decided for his children it was time to move to the city, because there they would be able to get an education. And he said, and one of his children, he even now has a governmental job. I decided to continue with my pastoralist lifestyle. Now we lose all of that. And my children, what is their fate? They don't have any education. They know how to deal with camels and animals, but not. And they will be marginalized, and they will be poor in the city. So the brother was migration as adaptation, was internal. his is loss and damage. And that's how we again can kind of overcome these very political discussions, and we need to make those decisions, those distinctions. And that's where again research comes in. When is it really a coping mechanism, and when is maladaptation, when is it loss and damage?
We are already at the end. We are short of time. We would have had so much more to talk about, but I thank you all for being here and for your expertise. Walter Kälin, Vally Koubi, Michel Yonetani and Marine de Clarens, and thank you. We will have a lunch break and we'll start again in 1 hour exactly. So we see each other here in 1 hour. Thank you for your attention and interest. Thanks.